Chapter 3. Only Cripples Will Survive. Unthan's Lesson. That life can involve the need to move forwards in spite of obstacles is one of the basic experiences shared by the group of people whom, with a carefree clarity, one formerly called Cripples. Before younger and supposedly more humane, understanding and respectful spirits of the age renamed them the handicapped, those with special needs, the problem children, and finally simply human beings. If in the following chapter I persist in using the old term, which has meanwhile come to seem tactless, it is purely because it had its traditional place in the vocabulary of the time that I am recalling in these explorations. Abandoning it for the sake of sensitivity, and perhaps merely oversensitivity, would cause a system of indispensable observations and insights to disappear. In the following, I would like to demonstrate the unusual convergence of human and cripple in the discourses of the generation after Nietzsche, in order to gain further insights into the structural change of human motives for improvement in recent times. Here it will transpire to what extent references to the human being in the 20th century are rooted in cripple anthropological premises, and how cripple anthropology changes spontaneously into an anthropology of defiance. In the latter, humans appear as the animals that must move forwards because they are obstructed by something. The reference to rooting provides the cue, albeit indirectly, for the reflections with which I shall continue the explorations on the planet of the practicing, stimulated by Nietzsche, and, in a sense also, the contemplations on torsos introduced by Rilke. In 1925, 2 years before Heidegger's Being and Time, 3 years before Scheller's The Human Place in the Cosmos and Stuttgart publisher Lutz's Memorienbibliothek printed a book with the simultaneously amusing and shocking title Das Peterskript, Aufzeichnungen aus dem Leben eines Armlosen mit 30 Bildern. The Peterscript, Notes from the Life of an Armless Man with 30 illustrations. It was penned by Karl Hermann Unthan, who was born in East Prussia in 1848 and died in 1929. In truth, it was written on a typewriter whose keys were pressed using a stylus held with the foot. Unthan unquestionably deserves a place in the pantheon of reluctant virtuosos of existence. He belongs to those who managed to make a great deal of themselves, even though his starting conditions suggested that he would almost certainly make little or nothing of himself. At the age of 6 or 7, the boy, born without arms, discovered by chance the possibility of playing on a violin fastened to a box on the ground. With a mixture of naivete and tenacity, he devoted himself to improving the method he had discovered for playing the violin with his feet. The right foot played the part of the left hand, fingering the notes, while the left foot moved the bow. The young man pursued his exercises with such determination that, after attending secondary school in Königsberg, he was accepted as a study at the Leipzig Conservatory. There, mastering an enormous practice workload, he reached a notable level of virtuosity. He expanded his repertoire, soon also including showpieces of the highest difficulty. Naturally, the handicapped man's violin playing would never have attracted such attention far and wide if it had been carried out in the usual form, without the element of acrobatic improbability. Before long, a vaudeville entrepreneur showed interest in Unthan. In 1868, still a minor, he began to go on concert tours, which, after stops in rural towns, took him to the European capitals, and later even across the ocean. He performed in Vienna, where he was introduced to the conductors Johann Strauss and Michael Zierer. In Munich, he impressed the Hungaro-Bavarian military band leader and waltz king Joseph Gungel by playing Gungel's brand new composition, the Hydropathen Waltzer. He was especially flabbergasted by Unthan's execution of double stops with his toes. After a concert at the overcrowded Grand Ballroom in Budapest, he was reportedly congratulated on his virtuosic performance by Franz Liszt, who had been sitting in the first row. He patted him on the cheek and shoulder and expressed his appreciation. Unthan notes on this incident, "What was it that made me doubt the authenticity of his enthusiasm? Why did it seem so artificial?" One can see in this note Unthan, who was already over 70 by the time he wrote Das Petterskript, was not simply touching on imponderabilities in relationships between older and younger virtuosos. Those questions, written down half a century after the scene they describe took place, were significant as a symptom. They reminded the author of a distant time when the illusion that he could be taken seriously as a musician, not merely as a curiosity, was still intact. Even 50 years later, the author still felt the cold breeze of disillusionment in Liszt's paternally sympathetic gesture. Liszt, a former prodigy himself, knew from experience what kind of life awaits virtuosos of any kind, so he would have known all the better what future lay before a young man who was to travel the world as a victor over a quirk of nature. There is a widespread cliché among biographers that their hero, who often has to go through arduous early first years, conquers the world for himself. In his mode of self-presentation, Unthan takes up his figure by following another anecdote with another and recounting the saga of his successful years as a drawn-out travelogue, moving from city to city and continent to continent. He tells the story of a long life in constant motion, on Cunard steamers, on trains, in hotels of every category, in prestigious concert halls and dingy establishments. He probably spent the majority of his career on dubious vaudeville stages, from which he would blow the baffled audience kisses with his feet at the end of his performances. The dominant sound in Unthan's public life seems to have been the cheering and applause of those surprised by his presentations. Unthan's notes, which can be neither called an autobiography nor memoir, the closest category would be that of curiosities, are written in a language at once naive and sentimental, full of stock phrases, echoing the diction of the factual account in the mid-19th century. One can imagine the author's tongue in the corner of his mouth while writing. On every page of Das Petterskript, Unthan demonstrates his conviction that the success of his life is revealed through an overflowing collection of picturesque situations he has experienced. Unthan lays out his treasures like a travel writer of the bourgeois age. His first concert, his first bicycle, his first disappointment. These are accompanied by a host of bizarre observations. A bullfight, in which the bull impaled several toreros. A sword swallower who injured his throat with an umbrella. Garishly made-up females of all ages in Havana in 1873, with an odour of decay hovering over everything. With dancing negresses, we saw the most forbidden things imaginable. A lizard-eating event in Mexico, sold out in Valparaiso with the recollection that the sun slowly sank into the still ocean as if it were finding it difficult to leave. 7 hours of brisk swimming without turning on my back, and heavy sunburn as a result. His encounter with an armless portrait painter in Dusseldorf, a comrade in fate, who painted with one leg. There was no end to the questions and answers. He was full of vitality and good cheer, but most of our chats touched on deep matters nonetheless. His mother's death. There was a praying inside me, though I did not and do not know what it was, praying. Appearances in the Orient, where people are more distinctive. A list of my most striking experiences alone would fill entire volumes. Disappointment at the Holy Sepulchre, where the most degenerate riffraff appeared to have gathered. arrest in Cairo, nicotine poisoning in Vienna, rifle shooting with his feet in St. Petersburg in the presence of Tsar Alexander III, guest appearance in Managua. The city of Leon bore the character of decline. A comet over Cuba. Participation in a film entitled Man ohne Arme, Man Without Arms. On board the Elbe to New York as a fellow passenger of Gerhard Hauptmann, who has a brief conversation with the artiste. Then the New World. Americans show a stimulating understanding in the face of the extraordinary. "You're the happiest person I know," said a man they called John D. "And what about you with your money, Mr. Rockefeller?" I asked him. "All my money couldn't buy your zest for life." Das Peterscript could be read as a sort of life philosophical performance, using the latter word in its popular sense. Unthan steps before his audiences in the posture of an artiste whose special virtuosity on the violin, and later with the rifle and the trumpet, is embedded in an overall virtuosity, an exercise in the art of living that pervades all aspects of life. It is no coincidence that the picture section of the book primarily shows the author carrying out such everyday actions as opening doors and putting on his hat. If one wanted to translate Unthan's more general intuitions into a theoretical diction, his position would have to be defined as a vitalistically tinged cripple existentialism. According to this, the disabled person has the chance to grasp their thrownness into disability as the starting point of a comprehensive self-choice. This applies not only to the basic auto-therapeutic attitude, as expressed by Nietzsche in Ecce Homo, in the second section under the heading, Why I Am So Wise. I took myself in hand, I made myself healthy again. Unthan's choice applies to his own future. He places the following words in the mouth of a 21-year-old who felt he had been released into independence. "I will seize myself with an iron fist to get everything out of myself." He interprets his disability as a school for the will. Anyone who is forced from birth to depend on their own experiments, and is not prevented from performing them, will develop a will. They drive towards independence, constantly stimulating further experiments. The consequence is emotional positivism, which is accompanied by a rigorous prohibition of melancholy. Unthan's aversion to every form of pity recalls similar statements in Nietzsche's moral philosophy. Only constant pain, for example, might be capable of wearing down someone handicapped. All other obstacles are defeated by the will which forges ahead into the sunshine. The sunny attitude to life of the cripple who has been able to develop freely leads, we are told, to a higher percentage of zest for life than is the case for a fully able person. Unthan ends his account with a summary in which he presents his confession. Quote, "I do not feel lacking in any way compared to a fully able person. I have never found anyone with whom, taking all conditions into account, I would have wanted to change places. I have certainly struggled, even more with myself than with my surroundings, but I would not give up those exquisite pleasures of the soul which came about precisely through the struggles caused by my armlessness for anything in the world." End quote. So it is ultimately only a matter of giving the cripple a chance to develop freely. This thesis is the culmination of Unthan's moral intuitions, which fluctuate between the urge for emancipation and the longing to participate. This free development should not be mistaken for a license to aesthetic excesses, as called for in the bohemian ideologies appearing at the same time. Allowing the cripple enough light and air in his development rather means giving him a chance to participate in normality. For the handicapped person, this reverses the relationship between bourgeois and artistes. Unlike bourgeois rebels against the ordinary, he cannot dream of following the people in the green caravan. If he wants to be an artist, it is in order to be a bourgeois. For him, artistry is the quintessence of bourgeois work, and earning a living through it is what gives him a sense of pride. On one occasion, the author remarks that he would not want to receive a fur coat for the winter as a gift from a noble sir, as Walther von der Vogelweide did. I would rather earn the fur coat with my feet. At the ethical core of Unthan's cripple existentialism, one discovers the paradox of a normality for the non-normal. What makes this existentialist, in the stricter sense of the word, is a group of three motifs whose development only took place in the 20th century. Firstly, the figure of self-choice, whereby the subject makes something out of that which is made out of it. Whereby the subject makes something out of that which was made out of it. Secondly, the socio-ontological constraints affecting anyone who exists under the gaze of the other. This produces the impulse of freedom, the stimulus to assert oneself against the confining power coming from the foreign eye. And finally, the temptation of insincerity, with which the subject casts its freedom away to play the role of a thing among things, and, in itself, a natural fact. From the perspective of French existentialism, Unthan did everything right. He chooses himself, he asserts himself against the enslaving pity of the other, and remains the perpetrator of his own life, rather than becoming a collaborator with the allegedly dominant circumstances. But the reason he does everything right, perhaps more right than can be expressed in any philosophical jargon, cannot be sufficiently illuminated with the thinking methods found left of the Rhine. The inadequacy of the French approach lies in the fact that the existentialism which developed in France after 1940 formulated a philosophy for the politically handicapped, in this particular case for the people of an occupied country. While in Germany and Austria, the last third of the 19th century had seen the growth of a vitalistic, therapeutically coloured philosophy for the physically and mentally handicapped, namely neurotics and cripples, that charged itself up with political, social philosophical, and anthropological ideas after 1918. While the occupation taught the French to associate existence and existential truth with resistance and freedom in the underground, Germans and Austrians had begun 2 generations earlier to equate existence and existential truth with defiance and compensatory acts. Thus the drama of quote-unquote continental philosophy, to draw this once on the laughable classification of content-oriented thought by formalists across the water, in the first half of the 20th century, can only be understood if one bears in mind the contrasts and synergies between the older and more comprehensive Central European existentialism of defiance and the younger, more politically restricted Western European existentialism of resistance. The first goes back to pre-revolution times, for example in the work of Max Stirner, and continues, after its culmination in Nietzsche, until the systems of Freud, Adler, and the later compensation theorists who became active in Germany. The second, as noted above, took shape under the 1940 to 44 occupation, with a history extending back via the revanchism of the Third Republic to the anger collection movements among the losers of the French Revolution. That is to say, the early socialists and communists. Once one has understood the German model, one will easily recognize in it its caricatured forms left of the Rhine. What circulated on the Rive Gauche after 1944 as a doctrine of the anti was the political adaptation of German cripple existentialism, whose adherents were committed to the ethics of the nonetheless. Unthan undoubtedly belongs to the earlier defiance existentialist movement, Because of the special nature of his circumstances, however, he was not fully subsumed under this tendency. What sets him apart is a special form of living nonetheless that isolates him from the heroistic mainstream and brings him into the company of artistes. His heroism is that of a striving for normality. Part of this is the willingness to be not simply an involuntary curiosity, but a voluntary one. One could therefore define his position as that of a vaudeville existentialist. Its starting point is the cunning of fate that commands him to make an artistic virtue out of an anomalous necessity. Driven along by strong initial paradoxes, the vaudeville existentialist searches for a way to achieve a form of decent exhibitionism. For him, normality is to become the reward for abnormality. In order to be at peace with himself, he must therefore develop a form of life in which his pathological oddity is transformed into the precondition for a successful assimilation. Hence the armless fiddler, as Unthan was known on American stages, could under no circumstances perform as a mere cripple, as was the custom in the European circus, and even more in the freak shows across the Atlantic. He had to present himself as the victor over his disability, and beat the gawking industry at its own game. The achievement of this success confirms Unthan's unusual position, which is once more occupied by various outstanding artists today. By managing to develop the paradoxes of their mode of existence, the handicapped can become convincing teachers of the human condition, practicing beings of a particular category with a message for practicing beings in general. What Unthan conquered for himself was the possibility of becoming, as a cripple virtuoso, a subject that can be beheld and admired to the same extent as it can be exhibited and gawked at. Exhibited primarily for the impresarios and circus directors often mentioned, seldom favourably, in Das Peterskript. Stared at by an audience whose curiosity often gives way to moved enthusiasm within a short time. When the existentialism of defiance is heightened into its vaudeville form, we see the emergence of the cripple artiste who has chosen himself as a self-exhibitable human. In the race against the voyeuristic curiosity of the normal, which must constantly be won anew, his self-exhibition preempts mere sensation. For him, the dichotomy between life and art no longer exists. His life is nothing other than the hard-won art of doing normal things like opening doors and combing one's hair, as well as less normal things such as playing the violin with one's feet and dividing pencils in the middle through a gunshot triggered with the foot. The virtuoso of the ability to be normal can rarely indulge in the luxury of depressive moods. Living in the nonetheless imposes an ostentatious zest for life on those who are determined to succeed. The fact that things may be different on the inside is no one's business. The land of smiles is inhabited by cripple artistes. I would add that Hugo Ball, the co-founder of Dadaism and co-initiator of the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916, was, alongside Franz Kafka, the most significant German-language vaudeville existentialist, both in his Dadaist phase and in his Catholic period. In his 1918 novel, Flumetti, oder von Dandyismus für die Armen, Flumetti, or the dandyism of the poor, he assembles a pandemonium of marginal figures from the sideshow and circus milieu, and has a speaker declare that these people are truer humans than the ordinary citizens who seemingly manage to keep to the middle. The vaudeville people know more about real life because they are those who have been thrown to the margins, the fallen and the battered. These jostled humans are perhaps the only ones who still exist authentically. In a time when normal people have devoted themselves to madness, they remember, as broken as they are, the better possibilities of being human. They are the non-archaic torsos who keep themselves in shape for unknown tasks. Thanks to them, the circus becomes an invisible church. In a world of fellow travellers complicit in the collective self-deception, the circus performers are the only ones who are not swindlers. Someone walking the tightrope cannot pretend for a moment. A little later, Ball stumbles on the trail of a sacred acrobatics, to which he erected a monument in strictly stylized, neo-Catholically aroused studies. Byzantinisches Christentum, drei Heiligen Leben. Heiligen Leben? Byzantine Christianity, 3 Saints' Lives, 1923. It is dedicated to 3 heroes of the early Eastern Church: John Climacus, Dionysius the Areopagite, and Simeon Stylites, and constitutes one of the central works from the twilight of the eschatological age. This brings us to a new development in our account of the phenomenon of practicing. By investigating the forms of life among the disabled, a class of practicing persons comes into view among the inhabitants of the ascetic star, where more particular motives gain the upper hand. They do not follow their asceticisms for God's sake, or if they do, like Ignatius of Loyola, who was crippled by cannon fire, it is because Christ impresses them as a model for the neutralization of their defect. It was not without reason that Christ was recommended for imitation by the founder of the Jesuit order as the captain of all who suffer. The visibly handicapped, however, only formed a marginal group among the ranks of the holy self-tormentors, whom Nietzsche saw marching through the centuries like hoarse choirs of pilgrims. They are not sick in the usual sense of the word, though Nietzsche did voice the suspicion that they were psychologically ill. Incidentally, both psychoanalysis and the official cripple pedagogy of the 1920s found among the disabled a propensity for envy complexes towards the able-bodied, the very thing from which Unthan insists he never suffered in the slightest. For them, leading a practicing life is a response to the stimulus that lies in the concrete disability. It provides the incentive of inhibition that sometimes provokes an artiste's answer. As Unthan notes, one must grant the handicapped freedom in the form of light and air in their development, until the blow suffered has been overridden by self-will and integrated into a life project. Thus, through the phenomenon of inhibited and handicapped life, general eschatology now faces its trial by fire. Now it remains to show how an entire system of insights into the laws of defiant existence emerged from the analytics of inhibitions. This requires an excursion into the catacombs of intellectual history. The most significant document of the existentialism of defiance is in fact of German origin. It is simultaneously the manifesto of the earlier discipline of cripple anthropology, completely forgotten in the philosophical and pedagogical fields. I am referring to the book Zerbrecht die Krücken, Break the Crutches, by Hans Wurtz, the Nietzsche-inspired initiator of state-run special education, a work that appeared in the early 1930s without eliciting the slightest reaction, for reasons we shall discuss shortly. The book is not mentioned in any history of philosophy. It is not covered in any anthropological textbook, and its existence is unknown even among Nietzsche experts, even though Nietzscheans, be they academic or not, would have every reason to examine the reception of Nietzsche's ideas among cripple pedagogues before and after 1918. One cannot possibly gain an adequate understanding of Nietzsche, however, without contemplating the effects and echoes of his work among cripples and their spokesmen. The reason for the book's oblivion lies above all in the political implications of its subject and the time of its publication. Appearing in 1932, a work with the title Break the Crutches was not timely in Germany. Not because the idea of breaking crutches would have been unpopular, however, but rather because the motto of the title attracted too many sympathisers, though they were admittedly not interested in the real handicapped people. Larger libraries list this rare work under its complete title, Zerbrecht die Krücken, Krüppelprobleme der Menschheit, Schicksalstiefkinder aller Zeiten in Wort und Bild. Break the Crutches, Cripple Problems of Mankind, the Stepchildren of Fate from All Times, in Words and Images. Published in Leipzig in 1932 by Leopold Voss. The author, who was born in the Holsteinish town of Heide in 1875 and died in Berlin in 1958, was orphaned early on, and began his career as a primary school teacher in Hamburg-Altona, then Berlin-Tegel. From 1911 onwards, he worked as educational inspector of the Oskar Helena home in Berlin-Zehlendorf, which had previously been the sanatorium and school for cripples in Berlin-Brandenburg. Under the young idealist's direction, this institution became a state-funded mecca of cripple care and gained an international reputation. Together with Konrad Biesalski, an orthopedist, Hans Wurz turned the Zehlendorf Institution into a focus for this new form of philosophical practice. The Wurz-Biesalski Cripple Institution maintained its position as a stronghold of the existentialism of defiance for 2 decades, before new directors with Nazi ties adapted it to the party line. Here Nietzsche's ideas on the equivalence of life and the will to power were to be put to the test in daily dealings with the handicapped. In the Reichstag elections in July 1932, the NSDAP had won 37.3% of votes, making it the largest parliamentary group in the Reichstag by some distance. The vociferous party was met with strong support among the newly disabled from the First World War, an estimated 2.7 million in Germany alone. As far as the motto, Break the Crutches, is concerned then, Wurz should have received a favourable response. The widespread desire in Germany at the time was that people would be able to live without the irksome auxiliary constructions of the care system, on a small and a large, even the largest, scale. The hour of moved emotions had struck. Only someone who could credibly promise the abolition of prevailing disability systems could appear as the leader of a movement with a significant number of followers. The prospect of a crutchless existence appeared on the horizon and became a guiding image for all who felt insulted, handicapped, and confined by their circumstances. The hour of people's anarchisms had arrived. Since its beginnings, anarchy had been the philosophy of the without. It sought to make its audience realize how many tools one finds in the modern order of things that can be dispensed with if one only believes in a life without masters or domination, without the state, the political crutch, without capitalism, the economic crutch, without the church, the religious crutch, without the nagging conscience, the Judeo-Christian crutch of the soul, and without marriage, the crutch on which sexuality hobbles through the years. In the context of the Weimar Republic, this meant above all without the Treaty of Versailles, which had become a fetter causing increasing anger. Beyond this, many at the time even wanted to dispense with democracy. Many contemporaries considered it no more than a way for the people to be ridiculed by their own representatives. So why not bring in the populists and try out-ridiculing the people's representatives instead? Breaking crutches was in the process of becoming the heart of revolutionary politics. Indeed, the motor of up-to-date revolutionary ontology. Beyond politics and everyday life, the call was heard for a revolt against everything that disturbs us through its mere existence. The crutch-weary wanted to shake off no less than the yoke of the real. All politics was transformed into politics for the handicapped in turmoil. Whoever wanted to channel the general anger at the given and prevailing circumstances could be sure that the majority of their contemporaries were prepared to recognise, in all manifestations of the institutional, crutches that were waiting to be broken. The 20th century belongs to the people's fronts against auxiliary constructions. Naturally, the NSDAP could never appear openly under the sign of the cripple problem that needed to be solved, even though it was essentially nothing other than a militant response to the question of cripples and crutches. The party resolved the contradiction it embodied by placing the dangerous subject of lives that were unworthy of life, Leben's unwertes Leben, on its programme. With this gesture it succeeded in radically externalizing its innermost motive. Otherwise the movement's leaders would have had to out themselves as crippled leaders of cripples, as the disabled specials needs educator Otto Perl did around the same time. They would have had to disclose what competencies and delegation structures made them eligible to stand at the forefront of the national revolution. Hitler, as an emotional cripple who sought to merge with the people's community in ecstatic moments. Goebbels, as a club-footed man longing to walk across elegant floors. And Goering as a drug addict who saw Nazi rule as a chance for him and his co-junkies to have a massive party. They could all have told the people about their struggles, their dreams, and their great nonetheless. The inopportunity of such confessions is obvious enough, to say nothing of their psychological improbability. Quote-unquote movements of this type live off the fact that their primum mobile remains in latency. The political space in those years was undeniably steeped in descendants of the cripple problem, not least because Emil Ludwig had made the disability of Wilhelm II a central psychopolitical focus for a wider audience in his biography of 1925. The public sphere was echoing with questions about giving meaning to a handicapped existence, and the compatibility of power and disability. Can the handicapped be allowed to come to power? What is power in any case if it can be attained by the handicapped? What happens to us if the handicapped are already in power? Nietzsche's meditations from the 1880s, seemingly removed from the real world, had become part of the fiery nucleus of politics within a short time. Hans Wirtz skillfully updated Nietzsche's perspectives by showing how disability, with the right schooling, can lead to a surplus of will to success in life. The material has been collected without any prejudice, we are told in the introduction to his book, which offers an encyclopedic overview of practically all significant cultural figures with known disabilities in Europe. Wirtz thus also mentions his contemporary, Joseph Goebbels, in his summaries and charts on the human history of the cripple problem. He lists the Nazi propagandist twice in the category of club-footed cripples, where he did not a priori have to fare badly alongside figures such as Lord Byron, once in the list of nations and once in the list of functions, with the classification revolutionary politician. Thanks to the cripple educator Wirtz, the chief agitator of the NSDAP is mentioned in a who's who of humanity, containing around 500 names, featuring the great and greatest, as well as figures like Unthan, whom Wirtz lists together with numerous comrades in fate in the broadly represented category show cripples and cripple virtuosos. What the protagonists of this work shared was the ability to make the philosophy of the nonetheless a reality. That Wurtz's list feature persons such as Jesus, who recent findings suggested was crippled by ugliness, and Wilhelm II, who had a crippled arm, but within whom there was also a crippled psychopath. Like the handicapped doll inside the handicapped doll, shows the magnitude and the explosiveness of this problem complex. Naming such great figures illustrated the theory, leading from the philosophy of life to that of spirit, that disabled persons can transcend their afflictions and anchor themselves in the realm of transpersonal values. In fact, Wilhelm had more than plainly neurotic political decisions to answer for. He had also developed stage sets for the Bayreuth Festival and attempted various other transitions into the objective. As for Jesus' breakthrough from the sphere of his assumed handicaps to the spiritual sphere, its results have long since been worked into the ethical foundations of Occidental culture. In Max Scheler's philosophy of values, which Wurtz presumably did not know, there was a parallel attempt to show the autonomous rules of the value sphere in relation to its basis in the tensions of life. Wurtz calls the epitome of action that leads to the transpersonal work. We understand that this word is only one of the pseudonyms under which the phenomenon of practicing continues to emerge. Quote, "Overcome inhibition is the mother of all unfolded movement." End quote. According to Wurtz, the movement here, termed unfolded, is not simply compensatory, but in fact overcompensatory movement. The reaction exceeds the stimulus. With this, the author had formulated a theorem whose ambit extends to asymmetrical movement complexes of all kinds, organic and intellectual, mental and political, even if he restricted himself in his book to demonstrating his thesis using the phenomenon of physical disability. These applications were demanding enough. Through intensive collaboration based on scientific research, he insisted, German doctors, educators and pastors should unite in the goal-setting collective for cripple elevation. Zielsetzungsgemeinschaft der Kuppelhebung. As high as he aimed, however, Wurtz remained unaware of the political potential of his reflections. Certainly he had stated in general terms that surplus energy from overcoming obstacles turns into a dynamic forward thrust. The lame Ignatius of Loyola and Goetz von Berlichingen were always on the move, as were the restless epileptics, St. Paul and Caesar. And there is no shortage of references to the short, crooked-necked Alexander the Great, and the equally crooked-necked, short, mongoloid, ugly Lenin, as well as the small and hip-lame Rosa Luxemburg. And yet, for Wurtz, the cripple psychological universals of sorrow and defiance retain a purely individual psychological meaning. A radical political change like the Volkisch socialism of 1933, however, which boasted above all of bringing movement, attack and revolution, what was this if not an external application of the law of compensation? If overcome inhibition is the mother of all unfolded movement, which maternal urges form the origin of the inclination towards self-aggrandizement through celebration and terror, what does it mean to go to the mothers if the word describes the product of inhibition and overcoming? If overcompensation for disability transpired as the secret of success, should one conclude that most people are not sufficiently disabled? These questions may be rhetorical, but they nonetheless show one thing. The path to a great theory of compensation is paved with awkwardness. As far as Goebbels is concerned, he was obviously not interested in the progress of this clarification. He showed little enthusiasm about his acceptance into the pantheon of the handicapped. Being listed alongside great figures such as Kierkegaard, Lichtenberg, Kant, Schleiermacher, Leopardi, Lamartine, Victor Hugo and Schopenhauer, to name only a few, did not induce him to out himself. Making his psyche available to science during his lifetime would probably have been the last thing he was considering. Nor would the central orthopedic principle of the Institute of Zehlendorf have appealed to him. The stump is the best prosthesis. In Wurtz's four-group classification, growth cripples, anomalies of size, deformity cripples, latent cripples, incorrect posture, and ugliness cripples, disfigurement, he would undoubtedly have had to join the second, perhaps also the fourth, as well as the subgroup complex cripples, which leads over into the psychological field. Goebbels had other plans. Supposedly, all copies of Zerbrecht die Krücken, not yet in distribution, were confiscated on his orders. The further course of history speaks for itself. Not long after January 1933, Wurtz was denounced at his own institute as an enemy of the people. His critics suddenly claimed to have discovered in him an armchair communist and philo-Semite. Owing to a well-timed accusation of abuse of office and embezzlement of donations, he was dismissed without notice and without any claim to a pension. Allegedly, he had used some of the donations received by the Society for the promotion of the Oskar Helena Home for the publication of Zerbrecht die Krücken, as if the book were merely the author's private matter, unconnected to the work of the institution he co-directed. It is not difficult to recognize in the allegations against Wurtz a conflict between the institution's field workers and the publishing alpha leader. His accusers, ambitious colleagues, took over leading positions following his removal, as if to make it clear that a successful revolution cares for its children rather than devouring them. Wurtz remained naive enough to believe that he could prove his innocence under the prevailing conditions. He therefore returned to Germany from exile in Prague for his trial, at the end of which a Berlin court gave him a suspended sentence of 1 year's imprisonment. He subsequently left Germany, finding refuge in Austria until the end of the war. In 1947 he achieved complete legal and professional rehabilitation. He was buried in July 1958 in the Berlin-Dahlem Waldfriedhof, the forest cemetery. It is instructive for our further reflections to examine the connections between Nietzsche's efforts towards the analytics of the will and Wurtz's deliberations on special education. Each author could have referred to the other to illustrate his axioms, which, in the case of the younger in relation to the older, indeed occurred. From the perspective of the Berlin disability expert, Nietzsche offers an example of his concept of overcome inhibition. He classifies the philosopher, without whose ideas his own work would scarcely be imaginable, somewhat cold-bloodedly as the psychopathically handicapped growth cripple, Nietzsche. At least the latter, he admits, through a combination of the laws of compensation, great talent and hard work on himself, managed to overcome his handicap partially, which is why his work should be acknowledged as an attempt to cross over into the trans-pathological sphere of values. Reversing the perspective produces a more complex picture. Nietzsche would recognize in the special needs educator from Berlin the phenomenon of the pupil, which he viewed with some suspicion, and about which we need only say here that they frequently display the weaknesses of their masters, and in compromising magnifications rather than their virtues. A second glance would show what concrete form the priestly syndrome attacked by Nietzsche took in Wurtz's case. The main characteristic of this phenomenon is the tendency, found among the stronger sick, to assume leadership of a following composed of weak existences. The literature I have consulted does not mention any disability on Wurtz's own part, so it remains unclear whether Nietzsche's diagnoses of the dynamics of the priestly ascetic ideal apply in the personal case of his emulator. The style of Wurtz's publications, which culminate in hymns to victorious fighters for life, certainly suggests a spokesman syndrome. The manner in which he is ignited by his own mission would support this. The proximity to the priestly type reveals itself in Wurtz's quasi-imperial taste for bringing increasingly large parts of mankind into his jurisdiction. Here the usual dynamic of the alpha leader becomes visible. For Nietzsche, an unmistakable manifestation of the will to power. Nonetheless, everything we know today suggests that for Wurtz, his work at the Oskar Helena home in Berlin was the focal point of his commitment. Outside observers are in no position to question the seriousness of his lifelong dedication to the welfare of his patients. Even if his authoritarian approach is less appealing today, and, at least on paper, one would sooner sympathise with the self-determination model of the alternative special needs educator Otto Perl. For its educational inspector, the Berlin institution additionally served as the pulpit from which he announced his suggestions for solving the riddle of mankind to a somewhat reluctant audience. These consisted mostly of modal transformations. You can do what you want. You should want what you must do. You should be able to want, and you are able, assuming there is someone at your side who wants you to want. The last variation is particularly significant. It defines not only the figure of the will trainer for the handicapped, but in fact the trainer's function as such. The trainer is the one who wants me to want. He embodies the voice that can say to me, "You must change your life." The phenomenon of caring for the handicapped in the spirit of a philosophy of the will that urges cripples to work on themselves belongs unmistakably within the radius of the major event described above. The de-spiritualization of asceticism's characteristic of the 19th and 20th centuries. Its counterpart on the religious side is the de-heroization of priesthood, temporarily offset from the 1920s onwards by the over-elevation of the sacred that was typical of the Renouveau Catholique and the pious branch of phenomenology, with delayed effects that can be identified among such authors as the ecologist Karl Amory and that para-Catholic phenomenon of elegance Martin Mosebach. While insisting on the jargon of heroism as an educator of the will, Wurtz ironically overlooked the pioneering element in the turn of the ascetological era to which his work belongs. For all his heroistic suggestion, it is his pragmatic focus on the program for toughening up the disabled and inhibited that is decisive. His pseudo-priestly manner should not be taken at face value. Behind it lies a phenomenon foreshadowed in Nietzsche's dietological theses. I shall call it the emergence of the general training consciousness from the particular case of education for the sick and disabled. Training naturally involves, alongside the trainee and the training program, the trainer. It is this seminal figure that gained a profile under the later Wilhelminian, life-philosophical and will-philosophical attire of Wurtz's declarations. With the appearance of the trainer figure, or more precisely its reappearance after its co-downfall with the decline of ancient athletic culture, the somatic and athletic renaissance at the turn of the 20th century entered its concentrated phase. It would not be insulting to call Hans Wurtz an imperial trainer of the handicapped, the Trapattoni of cripples, as it were. He stands in a line of trainer authors extending back to Max Stirner, author of The Ego and Its Own, 1845. Needless to say, Wurtz, with his sure instinct for team selection, counted the latter among his exemplary clients. In his function as the trainer of one's own uniqueness, Stirner was one of the first to realize that the metaphysically overweight do not cut a fine figure on the playing field of existence. The removal of ideological rafters in people's heads that he recommended in his book was already nothing other than an explicit mental fitness program. With regard to this patriarch of egotism, Wirtz managed to formulate a generalization of considerable scope. Quote, "In keeping with his psychological structure, the cripple Stirner sees all other people as unconscious and involuntary fighters for the value of the ego." End quote. For Wirtz, this confirms his initial assumption. Being aware of one's uniqueness and being a fighter for life converge. Today one would phrase it more carefully. Disabilities lead not infrequently to sensitizations, and these can bring about increased efforts, which under favourable conditions results in greater life achievements. While Stirner's uniqueness remained trapped within neurosis, as Wirtz regretfully points out, constructive work with the handicapped should aim to free the problematic cripple to become a person of character. We would no longer formulate it in this way today, whether speaking about pre-revolution philosophers or other problematic natures. The hypothesis that the special educator, in his practical and moral philosophical profile, embodies one of the first instances of the modern trainer, can be substantiated through numerous of the author's own statements. In Wirtz's case, it is clear. The trainer is the timely partner in non-metaphysical vertical tensions, which give the trainee's life a secure sense of above and below. He is responsible for ensuring that medically prescribed exercises give this ability, acquired by the client, a rooting in his powers, so that his will to survive also finds a concrete basis. With a clarity that would be an asset to an analytic philosophy of sport, Wirtz declares at the training theoretically decisive point, referring to the disabled person, quote, "His will thus gives his life an inner gradient, if he compares his earlier state of powerlessness with the abilities he has triumphantly acquired, and measures the success he has already achieved against the goal of his regimen. His striving gains a forward drive. Overcoming the earlier sense of powerlessness is simultaneously an ethical victory. The carefully mediating character of the education must not be burdened with a fear of excessive strain. We therefore demand a life-affirming attitude in those who educate the handless." End quote. There cannot be many statements in recent literature that encapsulate the post-metaphysical transformation of vertical tension, that is, of the inherent awareness of vital asymmetry, so explicitly. For this gain in explication, one has to take a few heroistic phrases in one stride. In their content, however, they are simply the mask of the athletic renaissance. One can, incidentally, also observe the de-heroization of the trainer's role in the sporting history of the 20th century. There is, however, a counter-movement in the field of sport, analogous to the developments in the religious field, that could be called the Renouveau athlétique. Here the extreme athlete is raised aloft as the spiritually empty counterpart of the saint. The philosophical anthropology of the 20th century ignored the contributions of special education, but nonetheless arrived at related observations from similar conceptual points of departure. With its own means, the anthropology of the ordinary person forged a path to an even more general disability awareness than the special needs educators could have dreamt of. Its practical conclusions, however, were diametrically opposed to those of heroic cripple didactics. Its maxim, "Do not break the crutches under any circumstances." One can already hear this warning in Viennese psychoanalysis, when Freud describes man as a prosthetic god, who could not survive without the support of civilizatory provisions for existence. With his Oedipus legend, one might add, Freud managed to incorporate the male half of humanity into the family of club feet, while diagnosing the female half with genital crippledom in the form of inborn penislessness. One hears the warning call even more loudly in Arnold Galen's doctrine of supportive institutions, which states that the delusional boundlessness of unleashed subjectivity can only be saved from itself through a protective framework of transpersonal forms. Here the crutches reappear as the institutions, and their significance becomes all the greater because the anarchists of the 20th century, on the left and the right, had called rather too successfully for their destruction. Galen was extremely concerned when he witnessed the emergence of a new without movement among the young people of the West in the 1960s. In his anthropological justification of institutions, one finds a culmination in the anti-Rousseauism of the 20th century, condensed in the warning that human beings always have much more to lose than their chains. He asks whether all political culture does not begin with the distinction between chains and crutches. This advocation of existence with compulsory crutches reaches its most dramatic form in the statements of biological paleoanthropology in the work of Louis Bolk and Adolf Portmann. According to them, Homo sapiens is constitutively a cripple of premature birth, a creature condemned to eternal immaturity that, because of this condition, which biologists term neoteny, a retention of juvenile and fetal traits, is only capable of survival in the incubators of culture. These highly generalized statements of modern anthropology present a functional explication of the holistic pathos that was characteristic of older cultures. Those cultures that insisted intransigently on the priority of tradition and custom, the established incubator, over the whims of individuals eager for innovation. Every orthodoxy, whether it draws its validity from religion or from being venerable and ancient, is a system for preventing mutations of the structures that ensure stability. In this sense, the ancientness of the ancients is self-validating, while a tradition, as long as it appears old enough, provides evidence of its viability and its compatibility with other stock elements. A new idea and its subjective deviation must first prove their repeatability, assuming they are interested in doing so. In the anti-mutation traditionalist systems, however, the presupposition is that even permitting the attempt to prove the usability of something new is never worthwhile. Periods with a greater openness for innovation, on the other hand, rely on the observation that even after far-reaching moral revaluations and technical innovations, a sufficient number of stabilizations are still possible in order to redirect our modus vivendi towards a more pleasant state. But the innovations must always be assessed in terms of their agreement with the need for stability in care systems for premature birth cripples, commonly known as cultures. Wherever humans appear, their crippledom has preceded them. This insight was the chorus of philosophical discussions on the human being in the previous century, regardless of whether, as in psychoanalysis, one speaks of humans as cripples of helplessness who can only hobble towards their goals, or, like Bolk and Galen, views them as neotenic cripples whose chronic immaturity can only be balanced out by rigid cultural capsules, or, like Plessner, as eccentric cripples chronically standing beside themselves and observing their lives, or, like Sartre and Blumenberg, as visibility cripples who must spend their lives coming to terms with the disadvantage of being seen. Beyond these forms of constitutive crippledom, historically acquired variants also come into view, most of all, if one believes Edmund Husserl, among modern Europeans. In their efforts to achieve the intellectual conquest of reality, they have fallen into two dangerously misguided positions of enormous dimensions. In almost pathographical formulations, he calls them physicalist objectivism and transcendental subjectivism. Both are modes of thinking, being in the world, that amount to comprehensive misreadings of the world and reality. If one considers that our existence in the life world constitutes the original relationship termed being in the world, since Heidegger, one reaches an ironic conclusion. Due to laboriously acquired misconditionings, we chronically confuse the first world with the second world of physicists, philosophers, and psychologists. The aging Husserl had adopted this precarious view of the civilized European as a cripple of world misreadings from his renegade pupil Heidegger, for whom man begins in most cases as a cripple of inauthenticity, and ends in the same state, unless he is lucky enough to happen upon a trainer who will put his orthopedic data of existence in order. Among the acquired disabilities, the neo-phenomenologist Hermann Schmitz recently uncovered a new one, a habitual irony. It robs the ironist of the ability to be fulfilled in shared situations. Here, the focus of investigation shifts to a crippledom of distance, emerging from an impairment of the capacity for participation through the compulsion to chronic elegance. And indeed, the role of irony in the history of reality misreadings has not yet been sufficiently acknowledged. The implications of these observations are as diverse as the diagnoses themselves. They have one thing in common, however. If humans are cripples, without exception and in different ways, then each one of them, in their own particular way, has good reason to understand their existence as an incentive for corrective exercises. We recall that in Wurtz's schema of crippledoms, short persons were classified as growth cripples. In later times, the same people were termed disabled in terms of growth. When it even became offensive to speak of disability, the small became those who have different abilities in terms of their format. In the 1980s, politically correct Americans found the most up-to-date name for people who often have to look upwards: vertically challenged people. This turn of phrase cannot be admired enough. It constitutes a terminological creation that outgrew its inventors without their even noticing what they had achieved. We can laugh at this formulation twice. Once at the correct preciousness of its authors, and once at ourselves. We have every right and reason to laugh, for we have an absolute majority in the assembly of those who are challenged by verticality. The formula has been valid since we began to practice learning to live, and, as I am seeking to show, one can neither not practice nor not learn to live. Even being a poor student must first be learned. In short, people had to speak about the handicapped, the differently constituted, to stumble on a phrase that expresses the general constitution of beings under vertical tension. You must change your life means, as we saw in Rilke's torso poem, you must pay attention to your inner vertical axis and judge how the pull from its upper pole affects you. It is not walking upright that makes humans human. It is rather the incipient awareness of the inner gradient that causes humans to do so.